Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Church of the Former-Day Saints with me, Zeli. So today I'm going to be continuing my series responding to Billy Carson and Paul Wallis's Bible study. And just a little bit of a disclaimer, today is going to be a bit more, I want to say, theoretical and philosophical because like for a variety of reasons. First of all, I am actually my area is much more in line with like the philosophy of religion rather than the specific nitty gritty of like textual criticism and all of that sort of stuff. So a lot of the stuff I'm talking about here is more me as I'm responding to Billy Carson or really anybody on the textual critical side of things. I will not say that I don't understand textual criticism. I have read into it. But when I do talk about textual criticism, the disclaimer will be that I I was not trained in the conventions, and I think that that's something that there are people, a lot of people, who are not trained in the conventions of some of these things, and I think that a lot of those same people are not very honest about that. But one thing that I am much more trained in is the philosophy of religion, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about today for the most part. So if you are not as interested in that sort of stuff, then feel free to skip this video or keep listening, and maybe we'll be able to talk about it. The reason that I'm very much interested in the philosophy of religion is particularly because I feel like when it comes to hermeneutics or textual criticism, whenever you get a data point or something along those lines, any data point doesn't come with its own presupposed interpretive framework. So you come across a piece of data, some bones in dirt, or a bit of text. That text and those bones don't come written with any sort of like explanation of what they are. We actually have to apply a narrative framework on top of them or an interpretive framework, which inevitably goes down to our narrative framework. And so the reason that I'm interested in the philosophy of religion is because I'm very interested in what is the most proper narrative framework that we can apply to the world and apply to the data that we receive. And so I'll talk a little bit about like how to think critically about a lot of these claims that these people are saying. I'll talk a little bit about how you can build a philosophy of religion so that when you come across different data points or somebody makes a claim based on the like some sort of bit of evidence, hopefully you will then be able to look at that evidence critically and say, well, okay, what does the evidence actually say? And and does it fit within my religious philosophy, or do I have to adjust my religious philosophy? So, if that's not something that you're interested in, I completely understand, but I think it'll be fun anyway. This is definitely more the nerd area in me. So, I actually want to begin by reading the top three comments from last video. I'll do this really quick, just because I think, that'll be fun, and you can go back and uh, read some of those too. So the first one is by Organic Royalty, who says, I haven't even watched this yet, and already I'm trying to figure out why. The Bible says everyone will hear the gospel. Matthew 24:14. Yep, yep. And I also don't know why yet, so, watch it. The next one is I Aware, I Awake 99, who says, when was Elohim referred to as false gods? Elohim are of El, right? And he follows that up with Elyon is the Most High, and Elohim would be the heavenly host, I was taught. And I actually responded to this fairly in depth, I'm pretty sure. Oh, I thought I did. Hang on a second. Well, I thought I had responded to this, but oh, oh, wait. It's just not, it's just not showing up. Why is it not showing up? Okay. Well, I'm not going to be as articulate as I was when I actually wrote my reply, but basically, yes, Elohim are of El. But let's say to answer your question more specifically, there's a verse in Amos 5:26 that where God describes two gods that the people of Israel are worshiping, and he says that I will kick you out along with those gods who you made out of wood and stone, which is, first of all, he's calling them gods. He says a star god, and it's the star Elohim. And then he says, which you made out of wood and stone. And this gets at the argument by Yehezkel Kaufman that I was referencing in this video here. And the basic idea is that it's not really the case that if you're a pagan, that you believe that you made a god out of wood or stone. The the way that Amos is talking about this is demonstrating that he doesn't really understand what idols actually are. And if his audience is at all receptive to this argument, it's also demonstrating that his audience doesn't really understand what idols are. There's another verse that I can't really remember where it's from, but it basically says, um, uh, you have said, let us be like the nations and serve their gods. And the idea there is that Israel doesn't really know what they're doing, but they're kind of wanting to just be the cool kids on the block and do what all the other cool kids are doing. And they do some sort of facsimile of idolatry, of worshiping these other gods, but they actually don't know what they're doing and they have no idea what those other people are doing. Um, and so that's kind of what Amos is describing. And the reason that that's important is Amos is like speaking from the 8th century BC, which pushes the monotheistic claims to early Israel. Like you could say that this is 3 centuries after the monarchy, maybe. But that really doesn't matter because most of the claims when people claim that monotheism was inserted into Israelite religion during the Babylonian exile, they are claiming that this happened, let's say 3 centuries later than Amos. And so Amos was right in the middle of that and demonstrating both that the prophet doesn't know what he's talking about, and this polemic against the fetishization of or the polemic against the gods is basically like a weird fetish and like at nowhere does God actually say if you continue to do this then I'm going to be in danger. He's just saying stop doing that. It's weird and it's not something that two people in a covenant do because Israel was in a covenant with God. And so it pushes that to like early Israel history, like right in the middle of the dynastic period. But this actually isn't the first time that this happened. This also is found in the Decalogue, in both instances, the Deuteronomy 5 and the Exodus 20 version. And this way of thinking is found in all of the documentarians. So if you follow the documentary hypothesis, which I don't, by the way, but if you do, it's found in all four of those sources that were redacted. And so that means that the earliest sources that we have, which would include, let's say, the source that we get from the Exodus, I think that's the Elohist source. Even that source is very starkly monotheistic and so monotheistic that they don't even understand what the gods are. And then the further claim would be, okay, but that actually was eventually that our version of those texts are the end result of, let's say, the original texts being corrupted. Now, okay, that's a strong claim. Where's your evidence of the actual textual history there? We don't have earlier versions of these texts that demonstrate some sort of alteration from a polytheism to a monotheism. And so you're just making stuff up at that point. But even okay, so even if it were the case that this is like a late version and these texts didn't represent Israel, like all of Israel at the time, the problem is these texts are old. And so these late versions would be the result of oral transmission. And this is why I brought up the book a couple episodes ago by Jan Vencina, who the book is Oral Tradition as History. And this describes how oral tradition is actually transmitted and eventually what happens, or no, no, let me take a step back. How oral tradition is actually transmitted. The way that is it is invariably collective. You don't get top-down religious reformation. And we know that from the Bible. I mean, Hezekiah and Josiah tried doing that. All of religious reform, all religious reforms have to be grassroots, essentially. And we also know that from history. There have been many of these sorts of attempted reforms, and the reformers were killed or run out of town. And so one example would be Akhenaten, who tried to go from polytheism to monotheism in a top-down fashion, and he was run out of Egypt. And another example would be like and these guys didn't actually do that, but they did try to bring some reforms. One of them was Socrates, and he was killed. Another one was Plato, and he was mocked and ridiculed by a lot of the Athenians. And then another one was Socrates, sorry, Aristotle. And none of them actually promoted monotheism, but they did promote a sort of uh, like you have to recognize like a philosophical God that would stand at the top of any sort of pantheon. And this God had to have certain attributes, which turned out to be a lot of the attributes that Christians believe God actually has. And the you could say that Aristotle was much more successful at this, but his pupil, one of his pupils at least, Alexander, didn't didn't actually follow through on that. He went around and collected more gods, and he himself, you could even say, was only successful because of the high degree of tumult at the time of his walking around and teaching and everything like that. So the oral transmission theory of scripture would actually be more evidence for the long-standing monotheism of Israel rather than more evidence of the long-standing polytheism of Israel. And it's just basically because all oral transmission is essentially grassroots and collective. And so if, let's say, the Deutero-Isaiah is centuries after actual Isaiah, then what you're saying is the Deutero-Isaiah is the result of collective Israel. And if Deutero-Isaiah is saying, for instance, that there's only one God and there's no God but me, then that means that there's a strong contingent in Israel that actually believes that. And maybe it's not all of Israel, maybe even it's a minority, but it's a substantial minority by that time. And so I think it's just that's essentially what I'm saying there. And that's been my argument. That's Yehezkel Kaufman's argument. That's not to say that Israel was monotheistic through and through. I think that would be a very naive way of looking at history. But it is to say that there was a strong monotheism from the beginning to the end of Israel's existence before the Babylonian exile. And then However, that is not to say that monotheism is okay. So Israel had not much of a knowledge based on Yehezkel Kaufman's belief. Israel didn't have much of a knowledge of the actual mythologies of those other nations, even like the Canaanites, who they were really close with. Like they were literally in the same space as the Canaanites, and they actually did not know like where is the Baal cycle in the scripture? Like there's no evidence that they knew even the Baal cycle, and that is like right next door to them. And so the on the converse though, Israel did have a strong angelology and a strong demonology. You do see that in scripture, but that is qualitatively different from having a pantheon. So I think that's basically the answer. I remember I said some more stuff and I said it more articulately, but you can go read those comments. And then the third comment is I'm very disappointed by Digital Nomad 1225. I'm very disappointed. I thought it was Paul Wall, and I listened to Billy for 5 minutes. Min, I want a refund. So I promptly gave him a refund, and that is simply the case. So let's get started with our video.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, this is an incredible discussion, man. This is really, really good. I'm glad we decided to do this because I'm getting a lot of incredible confirmation from you. And I'm also learning so much as well because you're giving me a lot of key points that I know myself now. I want to go back and dig into and research and look at it and gain some of my own perspectives as well, which is important. I think everyone should be able to do that. Everyone should have the right to ask questions, to dig deeper, to not be afraid to research, and to look into what they believe in without feeling any type of punishment or anything that's going to come to harm them. I believe it's my God-given right to be able to look deeper into anything I come across.
Yes, I think so. I think there are forms of Christianity that have discouraged curiosity, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's this verse that often gets repeated, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And you don't want to do that. There's this doctrine of the fall that says, well, your own understanding is impaired, so, better not get too far into the world of logic and reason because you're going to make a mistake. And Christians can be made very anxious rather than curious.
Yeah.
Whereas I find, especially when I read the Gospels and I try to get to the root meaning of the key words in Jesus' teaching, he's actually trying to stoke our curiosity. There's plenty in the Old Testament as well, from some of the later prophets and in the devotional writings, that would want us to be seekers, truth seekers, explorers, want us to be curious. And I think it's a shame that very often, both in Catholic and Reformed Christianity, curiosity has been discouraged, even to the point of the church pushing back on new science and new discoveries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know.
Okay. So the basic claim here, and let me go to my notes. Like I said, I'm doing notes here. I feel like the notes did help me stay on track last week, and so that is what I'm going to be continuing to do. So the basic claim is that Christians are sometimes anti-philosophy, and that curiosity has historically been discouraged. And the evidence he brings is the verse, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. And the way that he describes Christians as interpreting that verse is your own understanding is dangerous. And he brings up the doctrine of total depravity, which is a Reformed doctrine and has been declared a heresy by the Catholic Church, by the way. But I think that is an interesting way of looking at it. So I think I'm going to start off basically with just saying philosophy is great. Philosophy is great. I love philosophy. I think most of the Christians I know love philosophy. Now, I do understand. I was a fundamentalist for 10, let's see, when did I start believing in evolution? I think I was like 25. Yeah, so I'm 30 now. This was half a decade ago, but I spent a good amount of time being a fundamentalist. The reason that I stopped being a fundamentalist, by the way, if you must know, is because I started learning Hebrew, and I found out that the Genesis instances where, or the Genesis story isn't actually talking about what we describe as history. But, that's maybe a discussion for another time. I think the issue that you oftentimes get coming from a fundamentalist background, because it does sound like both of these guys are coming from, at the very least, they're arguing against or polemicizing a fundamentalist Christianity. Two problems with that. Fundamentalism is relatively new. There have always been like fundamentalists, but in terms of the modern fundamentalist movement, it is very new. In terms of curiosity in science, I think that we kind of forget that all of science was basically Christian until very late. Like, go back to Francis Bacon, go to Descartes, go to like the reformers. Science itself is a Christian phenomenon. And you can know this because most of the fields of science were actually started by Christians. And other people have done videos on this. I'm not really going to go into it, but let's say if I had to just briefly describe the history of Christianity and its relationship to philosophy, I would just begin with, let's say, the Book of Hebrews. Book of Hebrews is a very philosophical tome, I would say. You read it and you will instantly get into the world of Philo of Alexandria, who is a Stoic, and he was a firm believer in the God of Judaism, but he was also a Stoic, and so he was able to syncretize those two beliefs. And Hebrews probably was at least heavily influenced by Philo. There were a lot of words that he uses that only Philo uses. I think there are 11 instances of I forgot what the term was, but 11 instances of words only found in Philo and not really found in any other Koine Greek literature that Hebrews also uses in the same sort of way. But Hebrews was also the author of Hebrews was a classicist. So he was an Atticist. And so you find a lot of words that are found in the classical Greek literature that's not found in Koine Greek literature. And so Hebrews was a highly educated, or the author of Hebrews was a highly educated person, and he most likely was birthed, like his philosophy was birthed in Alexandria, and he was very much within the Alexandrian school of thought, which was a highly philosophical segment of Judaism and Christianity. Like from Alexandria, we get like Clement of Alexandria, who's he's a philosopher essentially. A lot of the early apologists loved philosophy. Again, going to Justin Martyr, his entire introduction to his book on the dialogue against Trypho, he discusses his experience trying to get into philosophy and finding various philosophers and schools of thought wanting for various reasons. And then finally ending on Christianity, which he describes as the true philosophy. And then I've described Clement of Alexandria before, and what he says, like the way that he describes the true philosophy is he says Christianity is the true philosophy, and you get, let's say, good things in Stoicism, good things in Aristotelianism, good things in Platonism, but ultimately what you but ultimately each one is distinct because each one follows their own falsehoods as well. And so all of those good things can be syncretized into the Christian faith. So the early apologists very much were in that vein. Augustine was a Manichaean, for instance, and that was a dualistic philosophical framework um, that came from Zoroastrianism and then was syncretized in the Greek philosophical realm. And Augustine was a Manichaean for a while, and then he eventually converted to Christianity. And there are a lot of people who suspect that he didn't actually, like, he gave up his Manichaeanism, but he didn't actually give up the underlying instinct towards this philosophical way of looking at things, which is one of the reasons why his writings are very much read and used as a guide. Then you have Saint Victor Lorenz, who he like he he's more of a theologian, but he's very much in the school of thought like how how do we know what is true and what is false? And he describes a very, like very early on, although all the other apologists also describe this, but he describes how you do know, and the way that you separate the wheat from the chaff is by looking at what the history of these schools of thoughts are, and if they truly go back to the good revelation of Christ. Then you have Saint Anselm, who came up with the ontological argument for the existence of God, which many people still use today. And it's been adjusted by Leibniz and by, was it Plantinga, who adjusted it and came up with the modal ontological argument. Then you have the Benedictine monks, they were monks, Saint Benedict, who established this monastery, and they were very much philosophers. And they were, sort of opposed to the Augustinian monks. Then you have Saint Aquinas, who was a Benedictine monk, and he, again, is the quintessential Aristotelian philosopher. He did a lot of work and did a very good job at syncretizing Christianity with Augustinian philosophy, not Augustinian, Aristotelian philosophy, because before Aquinas, Christianity was very much in the Platonic vein, and then Aquinas said, actually, we should be in the Aristotelian vein. Rene Descartes, he also was one of the founders of critical philosophy and, let's say, how do you minimalist epistemology. Soren Kierkegaard, the inventor of existentialist philosophy, again, a Christian, Alasdair MacIntyre, who is one of the most important ethicists in our day. And of course, you have two popes, Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, who have written philosophical tracts very much in the realm of reasoning. And science, like the last point is, science in the West has, for the most part, been an intra-Christian dispute for the vast majority of the time. And I think that it is like you can point to one or two instances where the church has come down hard against science, but, or you could say a particular scientific inquiry. But even then, if you look deeper into those instances, like for instance, Galileo, he wanted to, I think he wanted to, am I thinking? No, I'm thinking of Copernicus. So Copernicus, that's another one. I don't think Copernicus was actually persecuted, but Galileo was persecuted to some degree. And the idea there, like if you actually look into what was going on, the Pope didn't want him to not publish his findings. The Pope wanted him to test his findings to the standard test at the time. And Galileo said, I don't think we need to because the evidence is strong enough as it is. And so you had that back and forth. And then the church actually, as they put him on house arrest, still let him do his work and then removed those restraints later. So, I mean, you have very limited instances where Christianity has been heavy-handed against science. So it's just kind of, it's not really let's just say it's a naive reading of history to say that we have historically had this distinction between Christianity and science and how did he describe it? Curiosity has been discouraged. That's not historically true. What has been historically true is that Christianity has said, okay, we have these specific claims, which are actually a very limited number of claims in the grand scheme of things, that you cannot go against. And if you think, well, I should go be able to go against every single claim. Okay, well, what about the claim that the world exists? Are you going to should I just go against that claim? Should I say that actually I'm the only person and therefore I can go around killing people? No, there are certain claims that you just cannot go against. And so when you have the physical world and the metaphysical world, and you look at the metaphysical world, or let's say you look at the physical world, and you have very obvious things that are true, you cannot actually go against those things and be rational. It is the same thing with the metaphysical world. Of course, the metaphysical world is much more dark and shadowy, and our understanding of it is very limited. However, if there is an instance where, let's say, a being from the metaphysical world comes down and tells us something about the metaphysical world, then that becomes as obvious as the stuff that we see in the physical world, regardless of how we hear about it. And that is essentially what Christianity has done. They said, "Oh, well, we can be infinitely curious about all these things. However, God himself, the ruler of the world and everything else, has come down in human flesh and given us a certain set of things that are just objectively true about metaphysics. So therefore, we just need to believe them. And people who don't believe them are essentially going around saying that the world doesn't exist. It would be like it is what it is in its essence is the is like the flat earthers versus the non-flat earthers. It's obvious that the earth is not flat. However, there are some people who go around and we call them crazy. That's what the Christians were doing to pagans. God literally came down and gave us some true metaphysics. If you don't believe those, well, then you're like a flat earther. You're just kind of crazy. And being crazy, like not only crazy, but you are immoral because I'm sorry, but ethics are metaphysics. Like they're a segment of metaphysics. And so if you are disagreeing with the metaphysic that God gave to us, and you're also disagreeing with the ethics that God gave to us, then not only are you crazy, but you're also immoral. And that's just the truth. So I said I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophical stuff that we have been discussing and sort of hinting at. And he talks about this here. He again going back to his claim, Christians are sometimes anti-philosophy, curiosity has been discouraged. And again, philosophy is great. However, and this is what people like him actually miss, this is what people like the deists and the Gnostics actually miss, is that philosophy can't reveal all truth. Philosophy is very limited. Philosophy is limited to what humans are capable of reasoning and knowing for certain. And so I'm just going to read Thomas Aquinas, his first question, his first article regarding this, because he describes what I'm trying to say much more clearly and much more articulately and concisely. So, question one, Article 1. Whether besides philosophy any further doctrine is required. So, of course, the question is philosophy enough, or do we need anything more than philosophy in order to have a true knowledge about the metaphysical universe? Objection 1. So, if you're not familiar with Thomas Aquinas, the way that he structures these questions is he has a question, then he has a set of objections to his position of the question. So, and you'll see this here. Then he has the on the other hand, or on the contrary, which is a little paragraph about what does Christianity typically teach. Then he has an I answer section where he describes his position, and it is most of the time in line with the typical Christian tradition, but sometimes he varies from it and diverges from it. And so This is basically how he structures these. Then after he does the I answer section, he does some rebuttals against the objection section. So that's how these are structured. The article, whether besides philosophy any further doctrine is required. Objection 1. It seems that, besides philosophical science, we have no need of any further knowledge, for man should not seek to know what is above reason. Quote, seek not the things that are too high for thee, Sirach 3:22. But whatever is not above reason is fully treated of in philosophical science. Therefore, any other knowledge besides philosophical science is superfluous. So I hope you're understanding that argument. It's basically saying that if you're talking about a way of knowing that is beyond reason, then you actually are moving beyond human capacity. And if you're doing that, then what you're doing is just kind of silly. It's superfluous. You don't need to do that because anything that is true that it is necessary for us to believe should be within the realm of reason. Objection 2. Further, knowledge can be concerned only with being, for nothing can be known save what is true, and all that is true, but everything that is treated of in philosophical science, even God himself, so that there is a part of philosophy called theology, or the divine science, as Aristotle has proved in Metaphysics 6. Therefore, besides philosophical science, there is no need of any further knowledge. On the contrary, it is written in 2 Timothy 3:16, all scripture inspired of God is profitable to teach, to reprove, to correct, to instruct in justice. Now, scripture inspired of God is no part of philosophical science which has been built up by human reason. Therefore, it is useful that besides philosophical science, there should be other knowledge, meaning inspired of God. I answer that, so Thomas Aquinas is now giving his position. It was necessary for man's salvation that there should be a knowledge revealed by God besides philosophical science built up by human reason. Firstly, indeed, because man is directed to God as to an end that surpasses the grasp of his reason. The eye hath not seen, O God, besides thee, what things thou hast prepared for them that wait for thee. Isaiah 64:4. But the end must first be known by men who are to direct their thoughts and actions to the end. Hence it was necessary for the salvation of man that certain truths which exceed human reason should be made known to them by divine revelation, even as regards those truths about God which human reason could have discovered. It was necessary that man should be taught by a divine revelation, because the truth about God such as reason could discover would only be known by a few, and that after a long time, and with the admixture of many errors. Whereas man's whole salvation, which is in God, depends upon the knowledge of this truth. Therefore, in order that the salvation of men might be brought about more fitly and more surely, it was necessary that they should be taught divine truths by divine revelation. It was therefore necessary that besides philosophical science built up by reason, there should be a sacred science learned through revelation. So again, the basic objection or the basic position that Thomas Aquinas is putting forward is that if you are only dependent on reason, look at all of the different reasons, the different philosophical schools out there. Now, you could then say, well, we'll look at all of the religions out there. That's actually a different line of reasoning because all of these different philosophical schools are getting to their positions through the same methodology. However, different religions don't get to their school of thought through the same methodology. For instance, if we're talking about polytheism, that or the nature religions, that is like by nature the uh, person deriving God from what they see in the world. However, if you are talking about the monotheistic religions, you don't have that at all. What you have is God actually revealing himself to the people of Israel or to the world through Jesus Christ and telling people who he is. So that's actually a very different way of deriving the truths about God. And then you could also say that there are different religions that are based more on like other philosophies. So, like Buddhism, for instance, is a religion based very much in philosophy. again, that's a different methodology from the way that the Israelite and the Christian religions were brought about in the Jewish religion. So there are different methodologies. And so because philosophy, through the exact same methodology, arrives at a vast array of different places, not only is it the case that not everybody can do philosophy properly, like using those methodologies. So if salvation is from God, like from an accurate knowledge of God, then not everyone is going to be able to get there. And so you're necessarily cutting people off just by the fact that they are, let's say, not very bright. Not only that, but you're going to, with a lot of difficulty, maybe get to the right place. And you'll only get there partially, and you'll bring along with this right place a bunch of errors. Now, you could imagine like what the deists actually believe, because they believed a vast variety of things. I don't know if you could call Spinoza a deist, but I would call him a deist. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, they had vastly different ways of thinking about God. And then you could go back to the Gnostics. Again, vastly different ways of thinking about God. And not only that, but the Gnostics did actually believe that unless you had these specific sets of knowledge, like secret knowledge that they're not going to tell everybody. Um, not like you needed those specific little bits of knowledge, and a lot of them were kind of like passwords or whatever. Unless you had those, then you wouldn't get there. So you couldn't get there if you're not all that bright. You also couldn't get there unless you like derived the correct sequence of philosophical reasonings. And then going back to the Gnostics, again, they carried with them all these different errors. So what Aquinas is saying is because of this, it is actually necessary if you're going to base a person's, let's say, salvation on their knowledge of the true God, it is necessary that God actually provides that to the people. And that's where revelation comes in, according to Thomas Aquinas. Now, it is also so if salvation exists, what does it exist on? Well, it exists on some sort of truth about metaphysics. If you are a minimalist and you think that, well, you just got to be a good person to get into heaven, okay, well, then you have to know what being a good person is, and that's a metaphysical question. And by the way, it's not just doing whatever the heck you feel like, because most of the time when you say you just got to be a good person, what you're saying is you just got to do all the stuff that I think people should do. And that is indistinguishable from saying I just got to do what I want to do. So that's not it. And if you're more of a maximalist like the Gnostics were, then you have a lot of very specific things that you have to believe. And in order to believe those things, you have to actually have God coming down and revealing them to you if you want to maximize the availability of revelation for people. So that's what Thomas Aquinas is saying. So he replies to his objections. So reply to objection one. Although those things which are beyond man's knowledge may not be sought for by man through his reason, nevertheless, once they are revealed by God, they must be accepted by faith. Hence the sacred text continues, for many things are shown to thee above the understanding of man, Sirach 3:25. And in this the sacred science consists. So the basic idea is what I was saying before. Although things which are revealed are things that we can't really get to by our own reason in a pure way. When it is revealed, then we actually have to have faith, and faith is it's a project of reason in a way. It's a propositional assent to some degree, according to Aquinas. Reply to objection 2. Sciences are differentiated according to the various means through which knowledge is obtained. For the astronomer and the physicist, both may prove the same conclusion, that the earth, for instance, is round. The astronomer by means of mathematics, i.e., abstracting from matter, but the physicist by means of matter itself. Hence, there is no reason why those things which may be learned from philosophical science, so far as they can be known by natural reason, may not also be taught us by another science, so far as they fall within revelation. Hence, theology included in sacred doctrine differs in kind from that theology which is part of philosophy. Basically, he's saying that every science has a thing that they study, and the thing that they study is distinct from the science itself. And this goes back to what I was saying. If you're a physicist, then you are studying the physical world or mathematics, the way that math operates in the world. If you are a theologian, you're not just making stuff up about God. You have an object that you study, and the object that you study is revelation. And this is the revealed world that God has given us in order for us to study. And so far from being contrary to curiosity, what Thomas Aquinas here is saying in the middle of the Middle Ages is that we should be curious. We should have faith, but we should be curious too. So revelation is necessary. Revelation is necessary because you can't philosophize your way into all truth. And if there's going to be any truth that is dependent on, or if there's going to be any salvation that's going to be dependent on truth, then the truth that and you want to make that maximally available, then that truth has to be revealed by God because not everyone can do it on their own. So this is where for me, it gets a bit more nerdy. This is a research project I've been working on for, I think, like the last year, just trying to figure out what revelation is specifically. And so I'm going to uh, essentially read my summary, and this is partial, so I'm not done, but I think I've got a pretty good idea so far. But this is a summary of the history of modern revelation theory. And if you want to read more, you can look at The Problem of Revelation by Avery Dulles. And he has basically a taxonomy of the theories of revelation that are out there, whether he agrees with them or he doesn't agree with them. And you can look at them and, figure out how broad this actually is. So I took his taxonomy, studied each of those different schools of thought, those different theories, and then summarized my findings in what I'm going to be publishing on my website eventually when I finally finish this project. So, first of all, you have objectivist positions and you have subjectivist positions. So, I'll start with the objectivist positions. The first one is the propositional theory. And for our purposes, the propositional theory of revelation posits that revelation is essentially propositional. That is, it must be capable of being expressed in language and specifically through objects and predicates that are intelligible and meaningful. Under this theory, the phrase God became man is revelation precisely because it can be put into propositional language, God and became man. According to John Lamont in The Nature of Revelation, propositional revelation consists of the content of declarative statements and the bearer of truth and the objects of cognitive attitudes like believing or hoping. The belief or the hope are not revelation itself, but rather the object of belief and hope is revelation. In addition, and this would be the propositional set. In addition, the content of a declarative statement is revelation, but perhaps the declarative statement itself is not revelation. The important matter is that truth is propositional, and even if the specific phonemes used are less relevant, what those phonemes mean are of the utmost importance. So that's the propositional theory. Then you have the event theories, and there are a variety of these theories out there. So I'm doing like a basic overview of the set of theories that they have. The objectivist theories or the event theories of revelation. So under these theories, God reveals himself through his acts rather than through his ideas. Perhaps he may speak propositions, but these are subsumed under the larger category of his action. This theory expands revelation beyond ideas and allows God to reveal himself through works like miracles. In Dole's description, this theory could be exclusive of proposition theory in that, according to some of its proponents, propositional knowledge add nothing to what is actually revealed. More expansively, as Vagagini describes his view of event theories, and this is Cipriani Vagagini in his book, his liturgy book that's like 1,000 pages. He believes God reveals through a sacred history. And by this, he means that God's works in the world, past, present, and future, can all be described as his revelation to his creatures. So those are, oh, and then you have objectivist event plus word theories. And so you try to just kind of combine these theories of revelation. These theories would combine the two aforementioned theories describing both God's works and his words as revelatory to man. So those are the objectivist theories. You have the much more narrow, like the only thing that can be described as revelation are the creedal statements, or the, okay, I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm gonna just ignore that. And then you have these event theories that describe revelation as how God does things. And you might say that the way he ordered the world is a form of revelation. And in fact, Billy Carson and Paul Wallis sort of describe a form of event revelation later on in the video. So moving on to the subjectivist theories, there's the charismatic theology theory of revelation. So these theories, originating with Rudolf Karl Bultmann, posit that revelation is the reception and understanding of what has been passed down by the individual, hence charismatic. To Bultmann, there is a severe lack of connection between catechetical methodologies of more ancient times and post-Hegelian man, saying, with regard to modern methods, quote, in all these post-Hegelian historical methods, in all of these cases, the original position in which the text lays its claim upon the reader is surrendered. And so basically what this means is because we're so different from the original hearers, this original position, we've entirely surrendered that original position. Actually, no, I'm getting that backwards. What Bultmann is saying is that our epistemic original position is surrendered, and so therefore we put ourselves back into a time that we don't exist in, and therefore when we receive this revelation, we're actually not translating it into our current existence. And so that he says that we can't actually describe that as revelation because we are having a like a what's that? We're having a homunculus of ourself being revealed to, but we ourselves are not being revealed to because we exist in a particular historical moment. Bultmann believed that the historical methods need to be displaced by an existential method of transmission of revelation in order for man to receive it as revelation, giving up a detached position to interpret the text from a distance so that the text can do what it was meant to do, determine a person's existence. So existence is an existential technical term for salvation, and this is evidenced by certain integrated sentiments and sensibilities and stuff like that. Bultmann is clear not to dismiss objective methods of hermeneutics, saying they need to take priority over the existential methods, but that the process of interpretation must be mediated by the interpreter's prior relationship to it, and that the process of interpretation, even interpretation of revelation from God himself, must presuppose understanding. So in other words, you have to first assume that you can understand revelation. And because you can understand revelation, then you have to think, okay, what is our understanding based on? And Boltman would argue that our understanding is based on our current historical moment. So if you think about like Vygotsky's theory of education, where you have these bits of scaffolding that we build, and then you can build on the scaffolding and then expand that scaffolding outward to build more and then more and then more. You need the scaffolding first. And what Boltman is saying is our historical moment acts as scaffolding for our understanding of revelation. So I only understand the works of God because I can place those works in a narrative framework that is already native to me and is not native to somebody else. I haven't adopted someone else's narrative framework. It is only mine. And because I have a narrative framework, I can understand what God is doing in the world. So that's a subjectivist theory. Another one is Karl Rahner's theory, and his theory might be called an existential transcendentalist view of revelation, because Karl Rahner was a Thomistic, a transcendental Thomist, and at the same time he was an existentialist. So, according to him, man is seen as wallowing in the mire of epistemic darkness, yearning for more, and this is straight from Kierkegaard. While revelation is seen as God's grace to man, wherein he changes man's horizon, which is a technical term for Karl Rahner. So Anne Claire Smith in Rahner's theory of revelation adds that this change in horizon is the mingling of God and man, where God makes himself the innermost constitutive element of man, granting man the gift of transcendent sentimentalities. Yet this gift is not something that man lacks and then God gives to him, but rather it is something that God created in man from the beginning. So the basic idea is you can sort of suppose that there is a like a shadow of a man that was out there, and like that's a, a possible man, but we're not that. Man was in a way, this possible man is wallowing in the mire of epistemic darkness. But because God has provided a sense of himself in man, giving him his image. Oh, man, I might need to pause this really quick. Giving man his image, that means that man is no longer in that limited horizon. We're no longer apes merely. We are expanded into infinity. So we're finite beings who have an expanded infinite consciousness. And he doesn't say that we can actually perceive infinity, but he does say that we can perceive that there is infinity, which is unique to humankind. And so these are these transcendent sentimentalities. A sentimentality, of course, is like a feeling, and in existentialist philosophy, these sentimentalities are like the feelings of integration versus disintegration. You feel like you're in the right place. You feel like you're doing the right thing. You have all of these different feelings, and they can variously be called happiness, although not, it would be trite to call it happiness, but that is kind of how they talk about things, even though they don't mean thing like a trite sentiment. And so Karl Rahner, he expands that to a transcendent sentimentality, where we can feel a sense of like perfection that we don't have. And this pushes us and urges us towards that. So yet this gift is not something that man lacks and then God gives him, but rather it is something that God created in man from the beginning. It is a sort of prevenient grace. My own understanding of Rahner's thesis, if I could boil it down, is that revelation is God's self-communication of his personhood. And this means that we must dissolve any suspected opposition between theocentric and anthropocentric elements in the interpretation of human existence. So we can't really talk about God as in himself without also talking about the human elements that we ascribe to him. And we also can't talk about man without also talking about the divine elements that God has given to man. And this is actually riddled throughout like the literature of, let's say, history of like Mircea Eliade talks about this, and I've mentioned that. I even was reading this website on Harvard. It was a Harvard subset website that was describing oral history, and I was wanting to get more books than the one by Jan Van Sina, so I could expand my own horizon on that one. But in that article, they describe how we basically the Mircea Eliade position that we can begin thinking about humanity when we look back and see some sort of oral narrative framework that begins to be transmitted. Of like beyond that, we don't think of anything like we don't have an understanding of what an experience would be like without a continuous narrative. So ultimately, Rahner's position would mean that revelation could not be distinguished from creation, and man, having a share in the divine image and having been brought into communion with Christ, the God-man, cannot truly draw a line between revelation of God and the revelation of man. The two need to be held simultaneously in order to understand either, in other words. And then there's one that I haven't actually looked into this next one very much, and so I can't be critical about what Avery Dulles says about him. But this one is probably much more in line with like the Gnostic way of thinking about things, and it's Gabriel Moran. His theory of revelation is that revelation is everywhere, and we just kind of have to go look for it. And so revelation is found in every religion, every revelation is found within us. We can't really distinguish human thought from revelation. So therefore, everything has to be considered potential revelation. And maybe there's true and maybe there's false revelation, but we actually can't distinguish between those. And I think that would probably be much more in line with Billy Carson and Paul Wallis there. So one thing that we notice when we're one thing I noticed when I was going through these different theories of revelation is revelation actually has three parts. You have the objective, what is revelation itself, and like what is it made of? In those objectivist theories, you have the works of God and then you have the propositions of God. So is it like what God says in Scripture? Is that what revelation is? Is it the creedal statements that the church defines as the essential nature of Christ's revelation? Or is it what God does? Like, is it his works? And and so that's sort of like there there has to be something. What it like revelation has to be something. It can't just be human philosophy and reason. I think that that's just objectively the case. Sorry. Um, so there's has to be some sort of objective reality to revelation. But then you also have the subjective, like, how do you know what revelation is? How do you reach it? Like, how do we perceive revelation? And so you have, of course, the basic questions of epistemology, and you have questions of epistemology on like just basic physical grounds too. There is massive debate about what the nature of knowledge actually is in the literature, and I think I'm not really going to get into it, but if I had to boil down essentially where philosophers have landed currently on epistemology, which is, I think, possibly there's much more nuance than this, but I'm just going to boil it down to this. But there's this idea of justified true belief. Like, what is knowledge? It is justified and it is true belief. And so there's a lot of questions about, okay, well, what does that mean? There are these the foundationalist theories of justified true belief, and there's the coherentist theories of justified true belief. Like, do you sort of collect a mosaic of beliefs and you're able to justify their truth, like justify the evidence of their truth, and then you put them together and that you create this coherent picture? Or is it more like you have foundational maxims that you can justify and that they are true, like you can evidence and the evidence is justified in bringing about your belief, your belief about them. And then you can build like a structure of knowledge from that. I think that's an open question. And Paul Wall, I don't think we got there yet, but Paul Wallis actually talks a little bit about this with Revelation and with Scripture. And I think I would be able to rightly describe him as a coherentist in this sense. But you have these different ways of looking at epistemology. And when it comes to justify true belief, you have to figure out, okay, what is the epistemic primitive? What is the first principle in epistemology? What is the first thing that you can justify? And when it comes to revelation, okay, what is the first bit of revelation that you can justify in terms of knowledge? And one of the things that the church has throughout its history relied on is what did Jesus say? Because Jesus is the apex of revelation. What did he say? And then the question is, okay, how can you justify your belief about what he says? So if you have multiple, let's say, theories of what he says, which ones can be the most justified about the actual truth of what he said? And the typical answer to that has been, well, what did his followers say about what he said? And then their followers after them. And so there's this sense that you have to get to the apostolic authorities. Of course, Jesus never wrote his words down, at least as far as we know. Maybe he did, and maybe the Gospels took his notes and put them together or something. But based on what we do know about him, he just didn't write his stuff down. And so what our greatest authorities are on what he said have to be his closest network. What did Peter say about him? What did James say about him? What did John say about him? And then you can expand that out from there. And in terms of like epistemology, though, and just an epistemic primitive, that acts as the nucleus from which you can build your knowledge. So I think I'm describing more of a foundationalist view here, but I think that in this sense, it's actually justified that, like, it's reasonable that that revelation is essentially foundationalist. And so you have this nucleus of knowledge about Jesus, and Jesus is the apex of revelation. And we already have established that revelation is necessary. And so therefore, if revelation is necessary, then we have to look at what is revelation. And revelation is God describing himself to man. And so if God describes himself to man in, let's say, propositions, that's one thing. But that doesn't actually tell us that God is fully understanding how we understand it. And so the apex of revelation is God himself walking out his revelation to us. And that's why Jesus coming down as the God man is so important, because he is walking it out for us. He has revealed that to us. Now, there's actually a lot more to Revelation than just that, but I'm not there yet. So you have this epistemology of revelation, and you sort of have to build off of this nucleus of like what is the bare minimum that you can build from, and then you can you can loop other bits of revelation into that, so long as they don't contradict this bare minimum. And this is where you get things like the four gospels. Historically, it has been essentially certain that the four gospels have been the authoritative texts on Jesus, like on his life and his death and resurrection. Oh, there was something I was going to say. It just, yeah. Another thing that's really important, and this goes back to epistemology, is when you talk about like what can be known, you can't really just talk about like rational propositions or something. What can be known has to be much more than the mind, but it has to be the entire body. Knowledge is more than just your brain. Knowledge is about how you act, how you behave. It's about everything that you do. And actually, and going back to Jan Vancina's book, the way that he describes a narrative framework, so going back to the narrative framework, you have not just how people say, or you don't just have the text to deal with, but you have the, how did he describe it? The playwright, not the playwrights, the actors of the text, which is very, it's similar but different. So like what areas are emphasized when the tellers of the story are telling their story. And so this text is not simply the text about Jesus, but it is about how this text about Jesus has been passed down from a very tangible way. And so Cipriano Vagagini describes this not just as like Revelation isn't just the acts of God, the works of God, but it is founded in an epistemic way on how we behave or how these acts of God are encapsulated in the human believer. This is that like you have to bring together these two disparate concepts, the divine revelation and the human revelation. So when you look at the behavior of these people from the beginning to today, that's when you can begin piecing together like the historical framework. Who actually is demonstrating an accurate revelation of God? These are the people who are um, integrated into themselves and into a community. Now, the way that this integration works, let's say I become integrated, what that essentially means is if I'm using Kierkegaard's language here, not language, because I can't quote him specifically, but I can use his concepts. So his concepts. If I'm using Kierkegaard's concepts here, what integration means is the self is in proper relationship with itself. So me as let's say I'm a monad. Now, I don't think Kierkegaard would think of the self as a monad. The self is essentially like a composite being. I'm a composite being. I have my emotions, I have my anima, I have my ego, I have all of these different elements of the self. And all of these have to essentially circumambulate each other so that eventually they become coherent with each other. And the person who becomes integrated is one who will uh, have all of their disparate parts cohere with each other. They'll have proper relationship with each other. I am essentially like a family unto myself. And the disintegrated person will begin to, like all of their elements of their self will begin to separate and become distinct from each other and become contrary to each other. And this is where what he describes as despair. So when you have a person who is starting to become integrated, what that doesn't just mean that they like themselves. What that means on a theological basis is that they are operating properly within the diagram that God has designed for them. They're operating properly within their telos, their purpose for being here. And this could be a variety of things. I think C.S. Lewis describes it fairly well in his book, The Problem of Pain. He describes people as having, as all trying to seek beauty, but each of their beauties might look different to each other. Maybe they both look at the same mountain range and see it as beautiful, but when they describe what that beauty is, they're seeing completely different things. And what that tells us is people have different they are each different puzzles with different contours and ways of connecting to each other that all have to sort of fit together in order to make a full whole. And so the way that C.S. Lewis describes it is God is not wanting to save humanity. He's wanting to save you specifically. And you are not just some sort of amorphic avatar of humanity. You are a specific individual. And so Kierkegaard would bring that into your specific components are wanting to become integrated. And when they become integrated, they are fulfilling what they are meant to fulfill. And when that is the case, they're also connecting to God himself, because if we are the image of God, then that image of God is an element of us. And if that image of God is an element of us, then that means that when we're integrating with ourselves, then we're also integrating with the image of God. And that means we're being placed into uh, this channel of sacredality. Now, this when you have these different disparate parts that are becoming integrated or disintegrated, what that means is you have a proper direction to go. And that's basically what ethics are. It's going in the right direction. And if you're going in the right direction, that means that there is a true north and a true south. You can properly go a one direction truly, and you can go in the opposite direction objectively, and that would be improper. And so when you are integrating with yourself, you're connecting into this channel of sacredality, and this sacredality is sort of like uh, a plane of existence that brings together different integrated individuals and integrated elements of the world so that they can connect with each other and with God. And this is what Jesus means when he says, love God and love your neighbor. And this is what we call the sacred. You enter into, let's say, sacred space, and this is where people have come together and they have brought together their existential integration into a location, and the location has kind of become sacred because of its contact with the people who have done well in connecting with God. And of course, God has done this. All of this is with the assumption that God is ultimately the cause of all of this. I'm not dispensing with that at all. I'm just talking about the human side and the epistemic side of all of that. And when you get to a sacred space, that sacred space is that area that has come in contact with that sacredality so much that it has itself become a uh, a dense channel for integration, meaning you come into the sacred space, and if you're disintegrated, you will be pushed away from it, and if you're integrated, you will be drawn towards it, and you'll be able to see its beauty. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that if you see something that is more integrated than yourself, because of this idea of circumambulation, let's say you're starting here, and I guess if you don't know what circumambulation is, it means that there's this point, and this is a Jungian concept. There's this point, and you have different elements of yourself, and you kind of explore each of those elements, and you kind of go around and around like in a spiral in a way, but it's not really a spiral. It's a very complex spiral. And as you go around and explore these different elements of yourself, let's say your good side, and you've done that enough, and then you're pushed down into your wicked side, and you realize that that's part of you, then you can actually start to get closer and closer to the center, where the center is the proper integration. Now, if you are on the outer edges and you see somebody who's like closer to the center, or you see anything that is closer to the center, and this would be proper revelation, then you could actually see that thing as unsacred because you just see it as kind of a speck. It looks weird, it looks dangerous to you. And seeing something like that is actually, it's sort of like seeing something new. And Jordan Peterson in his book Maps of Meaning describes this as when you see something new just on a very broad anthropic level, anthropological level, the seeing the something new immediately gets put into your like the part of yourself that is unknown. And what is unknown is immediately seen as dangerous. Like it could be any variety of things. It could be good, but it could also be dangerous. And it's better to assume that it's dangerous than to assume that it's good. And so therefore you assume that it's dangerous at first, but then once you explore it from a safe distance, then you can eventually bring it into the a proper category of either dangerous or good. And if it's good, then you've learned something new. When you see something new, though, and it's a person who is properly integrated, that looks dangerous because it is new and it could be dangerous. And if you think it's dangerous enough at first and you push it away far enough that you aren't actually able to look at it, then you essentially reject that revelation that is embodied within that person. So, for instance, and then of course, revelation on an epistemic level is the person who has integrated with himself and connected to the revelation of God, which is both his works and his propositions in unity with each other. And that's that objective side of the revelation of God. So when you look at a a person who is integrated like that, they're properly connected to the revelation of God, which is that channel of proper sacredality that looks bad. It looks unsacred. It's unfamiliar because you're still stuck out here in circumambulation. They may be down here, and you're only familiar with these borders. And closer inside actually is darkness, and you can't actually see that, and so therefore it looks foreign and dangerous. Now you're here. You're not out here. Those guys out here are dangerous. Those are like the psychopaths and stuff. You're not a psychopath, so you're here. However, you have those guys who are here who are saints. Those guys also kind of look like psychopaths because they're also part of that area of darkness that you haven't been able to fully get close to enough to explore. And so you reject them. Once you start to get closer and closer to this center where you have integrated with yourself and with the image of God, and therefore with as much as you can integrate with God Himself, you start to see these different areas of sacredness as actually sacred. You start to see them properly. And that's when you start to draw closer and closer to those people so that you can begin to create this space of proper integration, of proper connection to the channel of sacredality. And so why is it that it is important to stay away from places that are okay, why is it weird to go to a graveyard? Why is it that like it's the normal thing for people to kind of avoid graveyards, and then people who go into graveyards we kind of think are icky in a way. Now, of course, maybe we think about this too rationally and we think that that's just sort of some sort of superstition or something. But why did we have that superstition for so long? Well, it's because that graveyard is where people have disintegrated. And if we're here and we see a graveyard full of people who have disintegrated, then that means that all of that is foreign and icky. But if we're, let's say, an atheist who's here, and you see people who are here who have like come as close to proper integration as they can, and you look at them and you think, well, those guys are also weird. You actually interpret the center as being closer to the perimeters. Those people are weird cultists who are dead to themselves and they haven't been able to learn, they haven't been enlightened to the degree where they can't learn that they are simply an organism in the vast cosmos, and the best thing to do is to enjoy life. You're falsely interpreting the center of the circumambulation as the perimeter, and that's also possibility. But once people begin to slowly get closer to their proper integration, then they also will begin to see other people who are properly integrated, and they'll begin to see them as actually integrated. They'll be able to discern between the center point and the perimeter of that integration. So that's all basically on the epistemic level of revelation. Revelation is, you basically know revelation because you have Jesus, who is that perfect communion between man and God. And we only are able to recognize him as that when we ourselves have been given the graces of having that broadened horizon into eternality and have been able to take that and uh, use that to guide us in the proper direction, which the proper direction is itself that closer integration. So we are able to recognize revelation when we have that scaffolding where we're actually still pursuing proper relationship with God. Now, of course, God himself is the ultimate actor in all of this, and he pursues us first, but we also pursue him. And when you have rejected all of that, as Paul Wallis seems to have, then you start to build false narratives. And these false narratives can be very plausible, especially to somebody who sees the center as the graveyard. And um, and then, of course, with those false narratives, you actually also start to pull other people away from the center in themselves as well, from proper revelation. So I think I've basically covered the objective, the subjective, and the mechanism of revelation. And so when you look at in other videos, people have basically said that I've done a lot of conjecture on these topics, and I don't think it's conjecture. I think it's psychology connected with theology. Um, what when you ask the question of what is revelation, and you say, well, it's not fundamentalism, which is true, it's not fundamentalism. Is it found in the Bible? Yeah, a lot of it is found in the Bible. Okay, let's start there. Where is the apex of revelation in the Bible? Oh, it's in Jesus. Oh, okay, well then he's the apex of revelation. So let's go from there and expand outwards. And when you start like becoming Gnostic and becoming uh, uh, or beginning to lack that metaphysical discernment, you're actually moving away from Jesus. And the reason that we know that is because the people who saw him transmitted a oral tradition and then eventually a textual tradition that was contrary to Gnosticism. That was contrary to polytheism and to paganism. It was its own unique thing. It was contrary to Islam, and it was not contrary, but it was like the fulfillment of Judaism. And when these people began to see all those other guys, the psychos out there that were promoting Gnosticism, what they said was, okay, how can you distinguish between proper and improper revelation, just on a very practical level, something that everyone could understand? And they said, okay, this goes back to Saint Victor of Lorraine. What has been passed down to us? What churches can be traced back to the beginning? What people have been entrusted by the apostles to transmit this objective propositional revelation. And those are the people who eventually made up the Catholic Church, and eventually the Orthodox Church, and eventually they're the ones that established orthodoxy. So why do we trust orthodoxy over revelation or over unorthodoxy or heterodoxy? Like, why do we trust the church over Gnosticism? It's not because we've just arbitrarily decided one versus the other, but it's because one leads towards integration and connection to that channel of sacredality, and the other doesn't. And I like my family has had a lot of spiritual experiences, so maybe I'm a bit more sensitive to this sort of stuff. But when you see people who are Gnostics, see people who are atheists, and all those that like set of people, they you can tell they look tired. They look not only tired but arrogantly tired, and their their facade of rationality breaks down very quickly once you just begin digging a little deeper and a little deeper and a little deeper. And it's just it's silly. So I've definitely geeked out on this a little too much. So I'm probably going to end it there. And of course, my special guest has been chiming in a bit, and that it tells me that she's probably getting waking up. So I'm going to end it there. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to let me know. And of course, like, share, and subscribe. I would very much appreciate that. And finally, one thing that I've noticed is there are people who like to come on the comments and sort of just say a bunch of nonsense, which I'm fine with. Like I like playing with nonsense. That stuff is fun sometimes. It's like a toy that you can mess around with, and then when it goes away, you're like, okay, well, it wasn't part of me. So, um, when my basic, not, I'm not going to say it's a challenge. I don't know what to call it, but um, my basic proposition is if you really think that I'm wrong about something and you want to point me to another person or group of people or video or whatever, comment that down below, and I will look at those videos and I will use that for material for the future. And so, as you can see, one of the recent videos I watched is this Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and the Problem of Certainty with Eric Ibarra, which is on the Pines with Aquinas podcast. And one thing that Eric Ibarra said that I thought was very profoundly good and true, and something that I try to emulate is that although do, I, I think that there is irrational skepticism out there. I also think that it's good to hold things with an open hand and be able to be open to being corrected because I don't know everything. So I will watch those videos. I'll look at those people, what they say, and if I find problems, then I'll respond to it. And if I don't, then I'll change. If they correct me, then I'll change my mind. But in the end, I gotta get going. So have a wonderful day. Shalom.